guys? Welcome back to the GM. It is your guy Boulanger. Up next on the GM. 2024 is a make or break season for the Ravens. Let's talk. You see, when I began to think about the 2024 season now within about 5 or 6 days from kickoff, right, when the Baltimore Ravens face off against the Kansas City Chiefs, what I began to think about is what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years. The wins, the losses, the circumstances around those wins and losses, and how this team has been constructed, who has come in, who has departed. And I've especially taken some attention to the leadership of this team. And I've come to the conclusion that the 2024 season is a make or break season for the Baltimore Ravens. What do I mean by make or break? I mean that if the Baltimore Ravens don't get the job done this year with this cast of characters, it is time to blow it up. And what I mean by blowing it up, I mean EDC must go, John Harbaugh must go. Some of those long-standing players with big contracts must go. The Marlon Humphreys, the Marcus Williams, the Mark Andrews, the Ronnie Stanleys, those guys must go. And it's not because they don't have value. It's not because they're not good players. It's because sometimes in an organization's life, they have to be able and be willing to hit the detonation button and press and have sort of a refresh or a reset, right? You see, John Harbaugh has been on the job for, I think, the second longest tenure in the league. And when you look at his last 12 seasons since the Super Bowl, the Baltimore Ravens have not really been close unless you consider 2023-24 season winding up in the AFC Championship as close. But other than that, they haven't really been close. You know, we picked up a franchise quarterback in 2018, and we've had some really good players along the way, but we haven't been close to winning a Super Bowl. We've been successful, but not close. You see, if I look at what has happened around the league with teams who've had good rosters, who haven't won, they've had to make a decision to hit the detonation button as well. Let me give you an example. Take the Chargers for an example. Yeah, the San Diego Chargers who turned Los Angeles Chargers. They drafted their franchise quarterback about 4 seasons ago now in Justin Herbert. They just paid him this off season. But when Justin Herbert walked into the league, he walked into a pretty decent situation. He walked into a league that had two number one type wide receivers. He walked into a situation that had a really good tight end at that time. He walked into a situation that had an above average offensive line and a building defense. He walked into a really good situation. And if you paid attention to the Chargers at all, what they kept doing is trying to add around the edges, add in the draft, add a couple of veterans, and and they were competitive, but not competitive at the same time. They had a competitive roster, but when it came to wins and losses, they were never really getting it done. And this is with having really good players at positions of importance, right? When you look on, you had Herbert, you had a really good running back. I can't remember his name. They built a young, talented offensive line. You had veteran wide receivers. You had a really good third wide receiver in Guyton. And so they had almost everything they needed to be successful, right? When you jump to the defense side of the ball, what do they have? They had Joey Bosa, at one point was a top-notch edge rusher. They went out and got Khalil Mack a couple of seasons ago to add to that pass rush. They drafted, I think his name is Darwin James, really good safety. They were trying to build a linebacking corps, with some young talent, and they drafted Asante Samuel Jr., who turned into a really good young corner. So they had what they needed, but the results were not in their favor. Now, am I really comparing the Baltimore Ravens to the Chargers? Not really. I'm just simply talking about the situation the Chargers found themselves in, pressing reset every year, or replay better yet, every year trying to run it back and seemingly end up in better situations. Yeah, you seen them go up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I was blowing them out, and then they wet the bed and lost the game. And they haven't been the same since. And so what did they do this year? They blew it all up. They moved on from Mike Williams. They moved on from Keenan Allen. They moved on from the running back. I can't. I want to say it's Cam Akers, but I may have that name wrong. Uh, you know, there was talks about moving on from Khalil Mack. There was talks about also moving on from Joey Bosa. They moved on from the GM and the head coach. Why? Because that old administration was no longer able to get it done. And it doesn't really matter who our quarterback is in Baltimore if we keep pressing replay and seeing the same movie over and over and over, at some point you got to be willing to press stop and eject and change the tape. But more of a perfect example, an example that has some more symmetry to what the Baltimore Ravens may need to hit the detonation button after this season is the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills are almost a perfect example of why the Ravens may need to blow it up. You see, when the Buffalo Bills began to depart or part ways with some of the more well-known players, Tre'Davious White, Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde, um, what's the other safety? Yeah, that's safety. Terrell Edmonds 2 seasons ago, and then they traded away Stephon Diggs, so on and so forth. You know, I saw Ravens Nation excited about the blow up, excited about what seemed to be an implosion. But the truth of the matter is, every team has to face that decision at some point. See, the Buffalo Bills had really good players, right? Well-known players, guys who could make plays on the field, right? Josh Allen had a really good corpse around him. But there was things that the organization didn't do to really get over the hump. They really never established a true run game, and they really never had that edge rusher who could close out a game. That was the purpose why they went and got Von Miller, right? And it wasn't until they got James Cook that they established a real run game where the quarterback didn't have to do all the heavy lifting as it pertains to running the ball. But by the time that they saw the light, it seems to be too late. And so Buffalo blew it all up. Now they still got their franchise quarterback and they still have a decently put together line. So here's the symmetry between the Baltimore Ravens and the Buffalo Bills. Okay. The symmetry begins when both teams started a new quarterback era in 2018. Both teams have been fairly successful. The Buffalo Bills have had a dominance over the AFC East. They've won that division, I believe, 4 or 5 times out of the 6 years that Josh Allen has been the QB. And excuse me, and they've also had some playoff success, arriving in one AFC championship game, I believe losing to the Chiefs, where Josh Allen did perform well. All right. When you jump to the Baltimore Ravens and you begin to think about the Ravens, Lamar Jackson and the Ravens have been successful, being dominant in the regular season, two of which have led to the number one seed in the AFC. Uh, the Baltimore Ravens have also been dominant over the AFC North. Every time Lamar Jackson has been healthy for a full season, they've been at the top of the AFC North. Uh, Even the 2 years where he went out with injury, they were also at the top of the AFC North. He also has captured two MVPs. Now, he has not had the playoff success as Josh Allen has, but yet and still, both franchises, both QBs have been wildly successful. Nevertheless, for whatever the reason, they both show up in the playoffs and they don't really get over the hump. Okay. But Buffalo invested in their quarterback and put some pieces around him, and they kept fighting and kept, plugging away, trying to get to a Super Bowl. They were in contention, I guess you could say, every single season, right? But they never got over the hill. But as they were fighting for playoff spots and fighting for the AFC East and fighting to get into a Super Bowl, that team was getting older and older and older every single season and getting more and more injured. Guys had to get paid, right? So then they began to pay their players as they should. But then after getting paid, those players began to get more and more injured. And so they had to make a decision where they had to blow it up, right? They traded away Stephon Diggs. They moved on from Gabe Davis, like I said earlier. They moved on from all those defensive stalwarts, right? And they had to hit reset at some point in order to replenish a roster and build a team around Josh Allen, right? The Baltimore Ravens are in a very similar situation at this point in time, right? Last year, everybody said it was the season they should have won the Super Bowl because that was one of, if not the best defense in league history. Uh, the offense had caught fire down the stretch, dominating good teams, and they show up in the AFC Championship and did not get done, which we'll talk about here in a second. Okay, but what's happening to the roster around Lamar Jackson, right? What's happened to that roster is those veterans who've been paid are just the same kind of situation as the Buffalo Bills veterans who had gotten paid. They were getting older, more expensive, but more injurious, right? Marlon Humphrey, you know, been injured, 2 out of the last 2 seasons, but his salary hasn't gone down, and nor should it, right? Marcus Williams been injured 2 out of the seasons he's been in Baltimore, but his salary is still up there amongst the tops as a safety, right? When you look at a guy like a Mark Andrews, right? Last 2 seasons, he's been injured, right? And but he has a really sizable salary. Ronnie Stanley has been injured basically 3 out of 3 seasons, ending last season on a pitch count, but his salary had not gone down. And so when you look at what is happening for the Baltimore Ravens, right? Uh, the players are getting older. They're becoming more injury prone, but their salaries are getting more expensive, which makes the Ravens incapable of signing the young talent around them. That's what we're seeing. That's why you saw a guy like a Patrick Queen leave, which, I think Trent Simpson is going to be a solid replacement. That's why you've seen a guy like a Geno Stone leave. That's why you've seen from 2 seasons ago Ben Powers leave because you had older injured players taking up a majority of that salary. And the Baltimore Ravens cannot continue to invest long term into these old injured players. It was a good thing the EDC went to Ronnie Stanley and reworked a deal and they're going to get him off the books next season. I suggest he do the same thing with Marlon Humphrey. Otherwise, it's going to be time to move on. I suggest he do the same thing with Marcus Williams, the same thing with Mark Andrews. I'm not saying throw these guys out the door. I'm simply saying if the Ravens don't get it done this year with this cast of characters, the likelihood that they're going to get it done with this group becomes less and less and less. Why? Because they get more expensive, but more injury prone. And so the Baltimore Ravens have began this quote unquote youth movement. So if we're going to go young, let's just go young. That's what the Buffalo Bills went ahead and did. They went ahead and they got young. That's what the Chargers went and did. They moved on from older injured players and they just got young. And so whatever happens, happens. See, because if I'm going to lose with these old expensive veterans, I might as well lose with young, cheaper, and in some ways more talented um, rookies and second and third year players. Right. So I think that it's becoming more obvious that the Baltimore Ravens are going to have to hit the detonation button on this team if they don't get it done. You see, because when you carry those old expensive players, it causes you to cut corners on an offensive line. It causes you to cut corners at wide receiver, right? It causes you to cut corners at edge rush, which are all positions that I think will show up big uh, or as big deficits when we get into the 2024 season. So let me know what you guys want me to know, man. Do you think that the Baltimore Ravens and Buffalo Bills situations are very, very similar? And let me be very, very clear. The symmetry is that these teams had Super Bowl aspirations. These teams put contenders on the field, But when they didn't get the job done, those players got more expensive, but more injured. And so either we're gonna go young or we're gonna have to win the Super Bowl this year. So at this point, man, this is where the administration comes into play. This is why it's important that the Baltimore Ravens be willing to move on from EDC and also move on from John Harbaugh and also move on from Todd Monken. You see, because what has happened is EDC has left the cupboard bare in some areas, which typically show up in the playoffs: offensive line, wide receiver, edge rush. Those things typically show up in the playoffs when you don't have those vital pieces. EDC has left this cupboard bare. Granted, he has tried to draft players. Granted, he has tried to bring in a couple of pieces here and there, but it was never that guy or guys who could really go and get the job done, right? That's why everything has continued to fall back on Lamar Jackson's shoulders. But let's go deeper. When you go to the coaching staff, right? See, if EDC goes, John Harbaugh has to go, and if John Harbaugh goes, EDC has to go because they're joined at the hip. They're kind of like best friends. But when it comes to John Harbaugh, let's take the AFC Championship for an example. I understand that uh, players have to perform, right? But what you saw was a lack of game plan, a lack of a lack of game plan, a lack of implementation of that game plan, and a lack of execution of that game plan, right? You guys saw it just like I saw it. When we look at the pure numbers from that game, right? When you look at Patrick Mahomes' passing numbers, look at Lamar Jackson's passing numbers. Lamar Jackson exceeded Patrick Mahomes' passing numbers. Lamar Jackson has more rushing yards than Patrick Mahomes, right? The Baltimore Ravens, I believe, have more total yards than the Chiefs. But the fact of the matter is, we still lost. In the first quarter, it was 7-7 going into the second quarter. We gave up 10 points. We scored none. So it was 17-7 going into halftime. Look, John Harbaugh comes out at halftime. We saw the interview. He says, "Yeah, we're going to run the ball more in the second half." And we absolutely did not. Those are coaching. That's not player performance. Those are coaching decisions. That's a game plan decision. That's an execution decision. That's a scheme decision. That lies with John Harbaugh. Even if he's not a play caller, he should have the authority and the ability and the willingness to go to a Todd Monk and say, "Run the dadgum ball." But obviously, he didn't do that. Don't give me some coach speak talking about we know we did what the defense gave us. Well, the truth is the Kansas City Chiefs were missing one of their starting interior defensive linemen, and Willie Gay, their starting middle linebacker, goes out in the first half. So the middle was soft as it pertains to running the ball, but we did not do that, right? See, we can pick the game apart and say, okay, Lamar Jackson had the fumble, Lamar Jackson had the interception. Those things are true. We can talk about Zay having the fumble on the goal line. We can talk about Zay having the taunting penalty, which took them 15 yards back from being inside the 10. But nevertheless, where was the coaching? You see, this has to be blown up from the top down. It's time. If they don't get over the hump this year, it is absolutely time for things in Baltimore to have a serious shakeup. And everybody's job must be on the line at this point because there's no way to go back from here unless you hit reset at quarterback and keep everybody else. But I don't see that happening either. So you guys let me know what you want me to know about the Baltimore Ravens and the Buffalo Bills symmetry, and if everything needs to be blown up if they don't get the job done with the Super Bowl in 2024. I'm out.